Okay, this podcast is on campaigners and reformers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do one that has about the anti-corn law, leaguers on, then I'll do another one about the abolition of slavery, then I'll look at factory reform, just so you can see how I'm doing it. So first of all, let's start off with what this is all about then. So during the 1800s, there was lots and lots of things going on. And one of the first things to go on in the 1800s was what was happening with the corn laws. So they campaigned basically about the price of wheat, because wheat was what was used to make bread. And you'll probably remember me showing you a loaf of bread in class, about saying about how important it was. So this was a staple food for the poor people. So before, what we'd always done is we'd always traded with France, and they had quite cheap wheat. But because we'd been at war with them in 1803 to 15 and not been getting on with them, we dug our heels in and refused to trade. So that meant we had to produce it all ourselves. So therefore we put the price of wheat up. So that might not have been the most, intelligent thing that we've ever done, but we decided that that's what was going to happen. So the corn laws were passed in 1815, and that was to keep the prices of wheat high, and it was absolutely terrible for the poor people, absolutely terrible. It couldn't have been worse. And because of that, there was riots up and down the country. People were massively, massively unhappy with this. Now, two middle-class men called Cobden and Bright got involved in this, and they were called leaguers because they were anti-corn law leaguers. They didn't want, obviously, in terms of people to be starving to death like was starting to happen. They wanted something done about that. And these two men went around the country, did speeches, they produced pamphlets. There was the penny post, that was important because you could send things around easily because it only cost a penny to post something, so communication had improved. And what ended up happening was they got elected as MPs, so that was a really big step forwards. Now, their argument was that actually if you charge less for bread, people then obviously would then spend money on things that were being made during the Industrial Revolution, so things like, cotton and things and clothes that had been produced in factories. But instead, they were like, if you just keep charging that for bread, people won't have the money to buy those things, so they were really concerned about that. So what happened is Robert Peel, the Prime Minister at the time, did agree with them. And Queen Victoria agreed with them as well, that something needed to be done because it was obviously really, really serious. The problem was for Robert Peel, though, is he was the leader of the Conservative Party. And the Conservatives, like they are today, they can be a little bit snooty, a bit rich, those sorts of things. So they don't need to worry about, putting, food on the table and things like that. So his party did not want him to get rid of the corn laws. They didn't want those repealing at all. Now, what really brings this to a head even more is that there is, in the 1840s, there's a potato famine in Ireland. Now, usually, obviously, we would help Ireland out because they're under, our rule as well. And we would usually, send them bread or, help them in terms of, stopping people from starving to death. So the poor Irish, they weren't getting any support from us in terms of, because the corn laws couldn't afford to, give them food and things that they needed, bread and stuff that they needed, and also the potatoes they usually would eat were completely rotten. So what happened is in order to be able to help them as well, Robert Peel repealed the corn laws, and that was really significant. So he repealed the corn laws, and his party didn't want anything more to do with him. But he finished his last speech in Parliament. He said, well, I hope people remember me for doing something that was actually right. So okay, he loses his job over this, and he never works in politics again, but he wanted people to realise that actually what he'd done was the right thing, really, and I've got a lot of respect for that. And what this showed was, in terms of the corn laws being repealed, the working class did have a voice. Those middle class men got together to try and help the working class, which was really important. And it also showed that landowners couldn't just do as they wanted. The working class did deserve to be able to afford to eat, and that was something that started to really sort of get more power for the people in terms of at the beginning then to the mid 1800s. The anti-slavery movement. Now, you'll know this pretty well, to be honest, because we did a lot about this in Year 9. So I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of things in terms of the causes, and then we'll go from there. So, one thing that's important to remember is you need to give a little bit of background about how bad slavery was. So you can talk about them being kidnapped in terms of capture, you can talk about the Middle Passage, you can talk about things like, the punishments on the plantations, all the things that sum up really how bad slavery was. And it went on for over 300 years. Now, the thing about it is we'd always, Britain, had done really well out of the slave trade. We'd made a lot of profit. So, I'm not sitting here as a British history teacher saying we were perfect, because we absolutely weren't. And what I want you to have an understanding of is that there was 4 key people who really started to push for this movement in England. So one of them that you've heard a lot about, and I showed you a film about, William Wilberforce. What a great man he is. He is one of my favourite historical figures. And he was just somebody who originally was just an MP for Hull, Member of Parliament for Hull. And he was a really strong Christian, and he absolutely couldn't bear the fact that people were being treated like this, that people were dying on the Middle Passage, 50% of them weren't even getting over to America, they were dying on the plantations. He really wanted to do something. So he spent his whole adult life, trying to abolish slavery. And this man managed to do that, and then 3 days later, after he did that in 1833, he passed away. But what a great thing to know that he was responsible for having ended the slave trade that England was involved in. Now, another man as well that helped him was Thomas Clarkson. And Thomas Clarkson went round and did a lot of research about, the Middle Passage and like the slave ships, and he drew pictures of them and like how, basically there shouldn't be all those people on the ships and how many people are thrown overboard and things. And he also became very friendly with Alado Equiano. Now, Alado Equiano also plays a massive role. So he's black, he used to be a slave, and he wrote his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of Alado Equiano, and in it tells you of all the things that he went through as a slave. And Thomas Clarkson and Alado Equiano met Wilberforce. They went to his house for tea, they got the chains out, they explained what had happened, they showed them that where he'd been scarred and branded and things through slavery, and it really sort of opened Wilberforce's eyes. He'd always wanted to help, but now he was more determined than ever that he was going to help. And the other person is Granville Sharp. So what he did is he used to take on, black slaves' cases, that he thought were absolutely appalling. So he was somebody who looked into like the slave ship song when a lot of people were thrown overboard and things on that journey, and he tried to bring publicity and show people, how bad things had actually been for the slaves, and that something needed to be done. So those people were massive in that movement. And they did things like, obviously petitions to Parliament. They got, they had people wearing badges, am I not a man and a brother? So they had, people wearing those things in support. They had people boycotting places that sold sugar, all of those sorts of things. It was actually amazing what they managed to achieve. So what did they achieve then? Well, in 1807, Parliament abolished the slave trade, but what it meant is it was illegal to buy and sell slaves. So that was a massive move forwards, but what it hadn't done is stopped it for the people who were already slaves. So it stopped any more being sold into slavery in terms of, Britain being involved, but it hadn't managed to free the people who were slaves already. So Wilberforce kept on going and going and going. That was obviously a huge thing to be able to get through. But in 1833, Parliament fully banned the slave ownership too, and also that was throughout the British Empire. So anything that we owned, they couldn't have slaves either. Now this was important because by us abolishing slavery, it put pressure on all the other countries to abolish it too, because it looked bad if obviously they were continuing to do it. And round about sort of 30 years later, you're looking then at America abolishing slavery as well. That comes to an end after the American Civil War. Now, many women also were involved, and this was interesting because they wouldn't usually get involved in anti-slavery things because they'd be worried about their position because they're just above really, sort of slaves in terms of social status. But Hannah More was one of those. She wrote poetry and things, met Wilberforce several times. She lived in Clapham, drew a lot of attention to it, helped him do petitions and things. So she played a major role. Also, many MPs in Parliament were really unhappy with the abolition of the slave trade because they had interests out in the plantations, they made money from it, so they weren't too happy about that. And also there started to be a number of rebellions on plantations, so there was pressure sort of from all areas why the slave trade might actually be abolished. And in terms of how it actually did get abolished, It was a staged abolition. So to start with, it was the ones that were 6 and under got freed first, and then gradually somebody else, and somebody else, somebody else, and it just went like that. So in terms of the abolition of the slave trade, those people were absolutely essential to making that movement work. Factory and social reform. So during the Industrial Revolution, things were pretty bleak, I'm not going to lie to you. A lot of children and women and men were working down mines, a lot of them were working in the factories, and to be honest, it was absolutely brutal, the conditions. So some of them were like coal hurriers, some were trappers down the mine, just opening the doors for, you know, like just sitting in the dark all day opening the door when people wanted to bring the coal out. Many suffered from absolutely terrible like lung diseases and things like that from working down the mines. There was explosions, you know, where sometimes there was one explosion where 28 children got killed, you know, down the mines. And also, in terms of the factories, they were dangerous, there was no guards on machines, people could lose their hearing because it was so loud. There was loads and loads of accidents in terms of machines collapsing on children and things like that. But because there was no health and safety, it was just sort of brushed under the carpet. Oh, it never happened, and nobody dared complain because they were worried about losing their jobs in there and also losing the place that they were actually living. So the Industrial Revolution, there was lots and lots of issues in terms